Since we were kids, we played games like Cops and Robbers. And if you were a cop, you wanted to be the paragon of the universe that we had created. You wanted to be the guy that was so good that always got his man. But if you were the robber, you wanted to pull off one of the most grand heists in history. You wanted the great train robbery. You wanted to be Butch Cassidy. You wanted Bonnie and Clyde. But in 1997, David Scott Ghant pulled off a bigger haul than all of those when he robbed on his own the Loomis Fargo vault to the tune of $17 million, 2,000 pounds of cash. He loaded up into a van and drove away in what's known as the Hillybilly Heist. This is the Rev and Rep Investigates.
We often like to say it sounds like a movie, but boy, in this case, it really does.
So Miss Campbell tells me y'all work together over at Loomis. Said you're one of their best employees, just a real straight arrow, clean as a nun's undies.
David Ghant, an Iraqi war vet who worked as a Loomis Fargo vault superintendent, pulled off the second biggest heist in U.S. history.
And once again, I hate to say this, I never felt so alive.
Loomis Fargo may look like a big warehouse, but the money inside belongs to the banks. And if you take it, well, technically speaking, you're robbing a bank, and that's a federal offense.
Oh, Lord, the things we say and regret 20 years later.
Was that really what it was all about?
Nah, it's always about the money.
On Saturday, October 4th, 1997, our hero of sorts, as we'll go with
hero.
Yeah, he's a bit of the main
in
character.
In some ways, he is my hero.
The main character of our story, David Scott Ghant, is working his normal Saturday shift. Now, he's got a guy that he's training on this particular day at the Loomis Fargo company. Now, the Loomis Fargo runs armored trucks, and inside their garage is this giant vault. And in this vault is all of the cash that the banks have given to them that they are transporting one way or another. Now, for those of you who don't know, armored cars transport all kinds of stuff, but primarily what they're taking is they'll go to a bank location and say a company needs stuff for their cash drawers. Right? So if Walmart needs money for their cash drawers during the day, Loomis Fargo or a company like them would drop off that cash so that they had enough money in the cash drawers. Now, when we think about something like, the cash drawers at maybe an Office Depot, you're thinking 2 or 3, so maybe there's $400 or $500 in there. But when you're thinking about a place like Walmart, right, that's got 40 registers, you're talking about thousands of dollars that are going in and out of this place. And so an armored car with armed guards makes total sense that they would be the ones taking care of this.
I have never thought of where the armored car goes. I always assume it goes from one bank to another, but having in this case, a hub, a regional hub, where all of the armored cars in the area come to bring that, it would make sense that they have their own vault there.
And this is a state-of-the-art vault.
Yeah.
There is one guy that is not a supervisor, not in a managerial position, that has a key to that vault. And that's David Ghant. And in October of 1997, David Ghant is fed up. He was raised in a middle-class family, got to go to private school. He enjoyed all of the pleasures of middle-class life in the United States. And as an adult, he's living paycheck to paycheck. He's not getting to shop at the department stores he did when he was a kid. Now he's having to shop at Walmart. And even at Walmart, he's having to get the stuff that is the Walmart brand. And he's becoming increasingly displeased with his life. And so what he decides to do is to send home his trainee a little early to use that key that he's been given, because he's such a trustworthy member of the Loomis Fargo family, to open up this vault and unload $17 million, 2,000 pounds of money. To really understand the story, though, we're going to have to rewind a few months. Now, if you've seen the movie Masterminds, we want to give you some markers, because Masterminds is the movie that was based off of this true story. So Kelly Campbell was a co-worker of Dave's. Now, Dave in the movie is played by Zach Galifianakis. Kelly Campbell is played by the very lovely Kristen Wiig. Though we'll find out pretty early on in our story that they don't really resemble each other that much. Neither of the characters. While Zach is probably my size, Dave is over 6 foot tall. And while...
What is your size?
Kristen Wiig, 5'8", and
you can tell me to shut up. And
yeah,
just keep
no,
going.
you're fine. If I were to tell you to shut up, we wouldn't have a show. So Dave is a little over 6 foot tall and is about 160. He's a skinny guy, whereas Kristen Wiig is tall and slender. But Kelly Campbell, the person she's portraying, the paper's described as pleasingly plump, with a smile that could stop traffic when she did smile. That she had very sparkly eyes that were part of what made her such, not just an attractive person, but such a flirty person and somebody that got the attention of David Ghant. Now, David and Kelly began to build a friendship which looked like it could take the form of a relationship to Dave. Now, Dave, as we said before, is scrimping and scraping for everything that he's got, and that means his relationship with his wife as well. Now, his wife Tammy and him had met at Winn-Dixie, and when he initially asked her out, they worked there at the same time, he'd said that she turned him down. But not long after that, about 3 months later, they began dating, and soon that blossomed into a young marriage. Now, they married in 1992, so this is 5 years into their marriage when Dave is realizing, as many married couples do, after the first few years, you start to sink into the routines and all the pressures of life and things begin to get to you. Now, Kelly Campbell, on the other hand, is married with 2 kids. And she's strained and frustrated and finally gets to the point where she's done with everything. She's staying at home, staying with the kids, but she ends up quitting Loomis Fargo. Now, one of the conversations that was often had by the people that worked at Loomis Fargo was, how would you rob us? And this works in 2 ways. One, it's an interesting conversation to have, right? But in the other side of it, it also helps with loss prevention. And the way that works is simple, that you get your loss prevention team together and your loss prevention team sits down, interviews several of your employees, and they're like, all right, if you were going to rob us, how would you do it? And it's a way that loss prevention can kind of see some of the holes in the game and the day-to-day, how money's transferred and why it happens in certain ways. And so these are things that kind of cross over different corporate thresholds. You get the same kind of thing in a retail store that you would get in a bank, and now you're seeing on the armored car side. So these are things that even the employees at Loomis Fargo during different periods in time are encouraged to think about. So Dave and Kelly have a lot of these conversations. Kelly's got a friend named Steve Chambers. Now, Steve Chambers is the definition of a low-level, low life. Steve Chambers has a record. Steve Chambers is portrayed by Owen Wilson in the movie, and from what we've discovered in actually talking to David Ghant is that he probably did the most true-to-life representation of the character. Steve's a small-time bookie who really, really, really wants to be taken seriously. He launders money a little bit. He's right at the point where all of this is happening. Steve Chambers is trying to fight a fraudulent check charge, because one of the things that Steve did, and you could get away with this a lot in the late 90s before cell phones and the internet was really as prevalent as it is now. I mean, there was dial-up. It took 15 minutes to check your email, and that's not an exaggeration. So what Steve would do is he would go and he would open up bank accounts with small amounts of money, and then he would go write hot checks all over the city. He would get his stuff, and at that time, you didn't have this instant verification. You'd write a check, you'd give somebody your information, and then you'd go. Well, he opened up bank accounts under false names and had bought thousands of dollars worth of stuff. And so he's fighting this fraudulent check charge, and he's also trying to become an FBI informant. Now, Steve's realized that if he were to tell the FBI about things, then there are times when Steve might be able to get a little extra money from the FBI. And so him and his bookie buddies would sit around and discuss what kind of crimes they may or may not commit. And then Steve would call the FBI under assumed names sometimes and tell them, hey, such and such a crime is going to happen in such and such a place. when it never really was. And so it wasn't too long after the first few tips that the FBI decides that we're not really going to listen to anything Steve Chambers has to say. But it's cute that he's calling in. So Steve is kind of working all of these angles. Well, Steve and Kelly are friends. They've been friends since high school. They're at a cookout one day, and the topic of a big score comes up. And there's a little bit of convolution in the details about whose idea it really was. Did Kelly suggest it to Steve? Did Steve suggest it to Kelly? And depending on which account you read or whether or not you're going to take the movie's account, is that it gets brought up that Kelly knows how Loomis Fargo might be ripped off. And that she knows the guy to do it, and his name is David Ghant. So her and Steve hatch this plan, and Kelly gets in touch with Dave and says, hey, you know what? What would you think about doing this? And at first Dave's like, yeah, I'm not really interested. And she goes, listen, if we do this, we can run away to Mexico together. Well, now Dave's hooked. He doesn't want anything more than to escape the life that he's in. He hates his job. He doesn't like going home. He feels like he's having to scrimp and scrape for every little bit of anything that he has. And so Dave agrees. Giving each other code names because of the movie Reservoir Dogs, Dave and Steve never meet, but they talk on the phone one time. On October 4th, Dave goes into work, just like any other day. He's listening to the radio, and the Steve Miller Band song, Take the Money and Run, comes on. He cranks it up, and with one last shot of adrenaline, puts his foot on the pedal and makes it to work. After a few hours of training a new hire, Dave lets him go early. He walks over to the vault with the key that he has, the only non-manager in the building to have the key, unlocks the vault, and over the next 2.5 to 3 hours unloads 2,000 pounds of cash with a hand cart, manually loading it from the vault to the van. Now, the reason that we know how long it takes, and the reason that we know that Dave did it, is because when he's done, Dave goes and he takes out 2 of the VHS tapes that are recording the robbery on the cameras. But what he doesn't realize is in the manager's office, the only door in the building he doesn't have a key to, there's a fail-safe VCR that is recording all of the rest of the security footage. Dave puts a lock on the door so that the vault can't be opened for at least 3 days afterwards. He hops in the van and he takes off. Now he tries to go out the back door, but the back door is locked and he can't get out. So now he's got to take this van full of cash, $17 million, to the front. So he wheels around to the front and he can't get in. He's stuck. Now, while he was getting ready to commit the heist, Kelly Campbell called him to make sure that he wasn't losing his nerve. And Steve Chambers kind of coached her through a conversation where she tells Dave that she loves him. And so it's this little bit of fuel that sends him over the edge to make sure that Dave's ready to commit this heist. And when he gets to the gate to open it up, the front gate of the place, mind you, that's facing the street, not one that goes to the back alleyway so they won't be seen. He's already starting to panic. Well, he can't get the gate open. It's stuck. It's too heavy for him to move on his own. And so a guy hops out of a Mazda 626. It's Steve Chambers' friend. Now, Dave and Steve have never seen each other. Dave doesn't know that this new guy's involved. And he starts working and talking to him in such a way that he obscures his face from him, while the two of them, working at odd angles so that neither one of them can see the other so that they can't recognize them at a later date, end up completely opening the gate enough for the van to get through. It gets through, they meet at a designated location in the parking lot of a business. And outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, Dave hands the keys to the guy that helped him open the gate. When he gives them to him, he says, look, hold on to this key. It's the only one that's going to be able to open the back of the van. Hops in a car with Kelly Campbell and heads off to the airport so that he can get out of Dodge with $35,000 cash. That guy promptly drops the keys on a key ring that contains every key that belonged in that Loomis Fargo. He drops the keys, and so it takes a really long time for them to find the key that goes to the back of the van, and once they do, they start unloading the cash into 2 rental vehicles. Now, Steve Chambers asks this guy, he's like, hey, do you have the keys to the van? We need to leave it running and unlocked. And the guy goes, no, I threw the keys in the van. So now the van's locked on the side of the road. And it's about this time that they realize they're not going to be able to unload all of this cash.
Yeah, it took him 3 hours to do it.
It took him 3 hours on his own to do it, right? Now he's got a couple of extra hands. He's actually gone. He's on his way to the airport. So what ends up happening is that they leave the smaller denominations of bills. Now, $3 million in ones and fives is left on the side of the road in this van, but to the tune of nearly 1,100 pounds. So the majority of the money in weight was ones and fives that basically equated to less than a fifth of what was their total. So they leave this money because they get tired. They just don't have enough room in the other vehicles. They take off, and $3 million gets left in this van on the side of the road. Now, the reason Steve Chambers had wanted the keys left in it is because he was hoping that if the keys were left in it, the window was down, it was on, that somebody might come and take the van, which would further obscure the police's ability in order to get to it. Well, that doesn't really happen. Dave and Kelly get to the airport, but the airport's closed, and so Dave's now got to go to Atlanta. But Kelly doesn't want to drive him. So Kelly drops him off at a bus stop. He takes a bus to Atlanta, grabs a cab, goes to the Atlanta airport, flies from Atlanta to Louisiana, and then from Louisiana to Cozumel, Mexico. Meanwhile, Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell start working out how they're going to distribute all of this cash. Now, the deal was that they were going to split it 3 ways. And with that amount of cash, each person should have gotten around $5 million. A substantial sum of money. Mm-hmm. Certainly enough to change their stripes. Now, Dave takes $35,000, which he's smuggled in a pair of pantyhose with him to Mexico, which is more money than not only than he's ever had, it's more money than he's ever made in 1 year. And immediately he realizes that his dream has come true. He has this wave of euphoria. He's finally away. He gets this relief, and now he gets to live the life that he always wanted to have. So Dave goes on this really weird spending spree. He gets to the airport in Cozumel, hops into a cab, and he tells the guy he doesn't know very much Spanish. He knows cerveza and por favor, which is just beer, please. And he starts talking to his cab driver. He tells his cab driver, hey, why don't you take me to a hotel? And the guy goes, cheap or expensive? And Dave goes, expensive is fine. Mm-hmm. So he ends up in one of the highest rated hotels in Cozumel. Tries lobster for the first time. Loves it. Has lobster every night for the next 3 weeks. Goes out and buys 3 pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses that are over $200 a pop. He's going jet skiing. He's going deep sea fishing. He's going parasailing, he's doing everything that he can, and on top of that, he's doing all of the touristy stuff. Now, when he was in Louisiana, Dave bought a bottle of hair dye. He changed his hairstyle, cut it a little bit. He dyed his hair so that he looked a little different, and that's not something that Zach does in the movie, because Zach wants to play Dave as this sort of lovable idiot, which in some ways we'll come to find that he is, and in others, that's not quite the case. Because as much as we want to be on Dave's side, Dave actually played a big role in this heist, not just because he took the money, but he also made some of the plans as far as what they were supposed to do in order to lay low. In researching the FBI, Dave found out that the first year that the FBI task force is on a bank robbery, they've got 6 agents that are on it. In year 2, that drops down to 2 agents. And if they have no leads after the second year, then it goes into a case file that it's rotated through periodically. Agents will look at, they'll pick it up, see if there's any new clues, and then it goes right back to the stack. The plan was to lay low for 2 years. Michelle Chambers, Steve's wife, isn't really in for that plan. You see, Steve takes the money, and him and his wife begin to count it. They're working with a few other people, and since the money's banded together, it's easy, and Michelle's running the calculator. And Michelle realizes as they're stuffing the money into barrels that they've got close to $17 million. And Michelle, who has been the wife of a small-time bookie that's been in and out of trouble, thinks it's time that they have a few upgrades in life. And so Michelle starts a very, very, very long trail that leads back to Steve Chambers. She goes into the bank. She walks up to the bank teller and asks this question: how much money in cash can I deposit before you have to report it? Now, if you're the bank teller, does that set off a red flag to you?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? It absolutely does. Now, some interesting things about the story at this point is this robbery happened on a Saturday night. Sunday, the banks aren't open, but on Sunday, Loomis Fargo is open because they're an armored car company.
Mm-hmm.
As long as cash is being exchanged somewhere, they've got work to do. Well, the supervisors get there and realize that they can't get into the vault and that it's been shut down for several days, which leads them to VCR number 3, where they watch in amazement as their top most trusted non-managerial employee loads every bit of cash out of the vault and into the back of an armored car. Well, the FBI gets involved, and the reason that the FBI gets involved and not the local cops is because that money technically belongs to the banks. It's FDIC insured, which means it's a federal crime. And so David Ghant has committed the second largest robbery in the history of the United States.
The other one, oddly, being also a armored car driver.
Yes, for the same company.
That took $18 million, just shy of what David did. Although I believe his run from the law was much shorter.
Yeah, he was caught almost immediately.
Yeah.
So Dave is away. He's in Cozumel. But Michelle Chambers on the Monday goes and tries to deposit as much money as she can without reporting it. Which, at $10,000, you got to make a report to the IRS for suspicious activity. But if you're a bank teller, you can kind of make that report whenever you think anything is suspicious. And so they do. Because Michelle Chambers decides to deposit $9,900 and saves one bill and puts it back in her purse from the briefcase that she brought to the bank. This
Very
is
subtle, Michelle.
This is
way to avoid suspicion.
The first piece in the FBI investigation that they'll come up with, but that won't surface for 3 months because the FBI has a stack of these suspicious activity reports from banks all over the country. And remember, this is 1997. They didn't just get an email that this happened that's easy for them to pull up. There's a literal paper trail of all of this stuff. So the bank teller files a suspicious report. When Steve gets back home, he's talking to Michelle, and they determine they want to change their stripes. So now we're going to tell an accelerated version of this story because to go into all the minutiae of every little thing that was bought and how it was bought and who all is involved would literally take us hours in order to do.
Also would be boring.
Some parts of it certainly would. Long story short, Steve and Michelle have lived in a rundown neighborhood. There's a golf course across the way in the next county.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not quite.
Yeah, they were in a single wide or maybe a double wide.
And so they decide it's time for an upgrade.
Yeah.
And so they go from that to a $635,000 house in one of the premier subdivisions in a gated community in Gaston County.
In 1997.
In 1997, right.
So this is $1 million home.
At
easy.
the very least.
Yeah.
And Steve goes to his lawyer. And he says, hey, I don't really want to draw a lot of attention here. Now, this is the same lawyer that's working Steve's phony checks. And he's like, look, I need to know how I can make a purchase of a home without drawing too much attention to it. I probably need to put about $400,000 down. Michelle and I want a bunch of money in Atlantic City. And he's like, okay. The lawyer goes, let's speak hypothetically. you won money in Atlantic City. You've reported all that money, correct? Like, yes. He's like, shouldn't have a problem. He's like, but if you didn't report all of that money, what you're going to need is cashier's checks and gifts in order to make this happen. So this is where the story really starts to take an odd turn, because Steve Chambers, in all of his brilliance of his small-town bookiness, decides to involve nearly every relative he has, handing them sums of money and giving them percentages of it. I'm going to give you $200,000 to put in a safe deposit box that you can give me as a gift, and you can keep $20,000 for yourself. Or how about you take this 10 grand, keep 2 for yourself, and get me a cashier's check. He talks with a friend of his whose wife works at a bank, gives that guy cash. She writes a cashier's check to the couple that Steve and Michelle are buying this home from for $10,000 without reporting it. And her husband keep 2 grand. Now, what's interesting about this is every new person that Steve involves is not only a name on the list, but is now an accomplice to the federal crime of bank robbery. His parents, her parents, their cousins, their friends, anybody that they grew up with that was dumb enough to say, oh, I bet they won this money gambling, here's a cashier's check, is now involved. At the end of this crime, nearly 30 people are going to be indicted, 25 of which have direct connections to laundering money for Steve Chambers, including the lawyer, because Steve decides he's going to leave $200,000 in a bag in the lawyer's office. And when he tells the lawyer he's going to give him 10 grand, the lawyer says, I don't think so. I don't know what's in those bags. I don't want anything to do with it. You're not giving me this money. And Steve goes, call it a Christmas gift. So when the receptionist writes it down as a Christmas gift, it goes down as a bribe. And the very first attorney in the history of the state of North Carolina is charged and convicted of federal money laundering, all because of Steve Chambers' irresponsibility with the cash. Now, remember, the plan was to hold on to the money for 2 years without spending it. At this point, the Chambers have spent $400,000 as a down payment. They're paying nearly $8,000 a month to these interior designers who they bought the home from, and they got a little something special from these interior designers. One of the most infamous pieces in the entire heist is not the money, but rather the giant velvet Elvis that they bought from the interior designers. It was the centerpiece of the house and is prominently featured in one scene in the movie Masterminds. That velvet Elvis was probably not worth very much money, but whenever they sold it, it goes for nearly 6 figures. Moving into the new house, though, it's not quite enough for Steve and Michelle. So they buy a BMW Z3 Roadster, the BMW 2-seater sports car convertible that was popular at the time. They decide to buy, if you've seen the movie Cheers, or sorry, the show Cheers, they decide to buy Tecumseh, a $600 cigar store Indian that stood near the front door of Cheers. Meanwhile, all of this is going on, and David Ghant is stuck in Cozumel, Mexico. Now, him and Kelly Campbell have an arrangement. Now, remember, Dave thinks that Kelly's in love with him. And so what they do is on Tuesdays and Thursdays, there's a payphone a little bit outside of the city. Kelly drives to the payphone and Dave calls. She says all the sweet things to Dave, reassures him that everybody's going to take care of him, tells him that she's going to come down to Mexico. They're going to live their life on the run together. Kelly gets back to work. Well, I say to work. Kelly gets back home. She's not working. The FBI comes and knocks on Kelly's door. They get a tip from somebody who saw the David Ghant video that the only real friend that Dave had at work was Kelly Campbell, and she'd been gone for a few months. Kelly's nervous. So the FBI agents talk to her, ask her a few questions about her communications with Dave. She says they really haven't talked very much since she left. And the FBI asks if she'll take a polygraph test. Kelly says no. And admits to the FBI agents that her and Dave really just used to smoke a lot of pot together. And she's worried that she'd implicate herself on other charges, so she's not going to take the polygraph test. Kelly calls Steve because she's pretty shaken up. Steve calls his lawyer, and Steve's lawyer calls the FBI on behalf of Kelly Campbell to let the FBI know that Kelly Campbell is not taking a polygraph test. This is the second of the many dominoes that are going to fall whenever they're able to connect Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell via this attorney. David Ghant, on the other hand, is living it up. He's doing absolutely everything he can and wants to do in Cozumel, Mexico. He's got a new life. He's got a new identity. He's known as Mike McKinney. Now, Mike is a high school buddy of Steve Chambers. And Steve bought his license and social security number and stuff from him to use for a fake ID to give to Dave. Dave calls and he's ready for some more money. Stuff's running a little thin. But when you're staying at a $300 a night hotel, you're having lobster every night, you're riding jet skis for hours on end, eventually the money's going to run low, even in Mexico. So Steve calls Mike, the real Mike McKinney. Now, the real Mike McKinney is an ex-Marine who never saw combat. He's helped Steve a couple of times, being muscle for him in order to handle some things, but Steve offers him a pretty good deal of a few $100,000 if he goes down and just delivers cash to Dave. Mike wants to know what the catch is. Steve tells him, hey, you're going to go down there, you're going to give this guy some money. I can't tell you where it's from, but we're going to call you Bruno. I don't want him to know your real name. Mike has no idea that Dave is the one who's using his identity at the moment. So Steve and Mike talk, and Steve says, if the opportunity comes up, I want you to kill him. Mike's like, well, must have done something pretty bad if you want me to kill him. And Steve goes, don't worry about that. The money will be in your account. If the opportunity comes up, kill him. If not, just take the money. Only sends him with $8,000. Now remember, Dave took $35,000 on his trip, and Bruno's only coming down with $8,000. They end up meeting one another after a few mishaps because Steve gave the description of Dave whenever Dave was still a strawberry blonde with a little bit of facial hair. But now that he's clean shaven and a chestnut brunette, it's not the same guy. So they miss each other a couple of times and then end up meeting in Dave's apartment, where Dave gets some really bad vibes. Also, he opens up the bag to realize that there's only $8,000 cash. Now, when Bruno discovered that Dave wasn't at the meet, which he actually was, they just couldn't find one another, he decided to spend a few grand partying in Cozumel. So
that's a good party.
That is a great party, but Dave doesn't quite have as much money as what he's supposed to get. The two part ways whenever Bruno decides that there's not a place for him to be able to kill Dave. Now, this happens around 3 more times, but in each one of these other situations, they meet in a largely public place. Dave and Kelly are still having these conversations twice a week, and Kelly has now got a new van. A new Toyota Sienna, the height of minivans. But her credit's no good. And she doesn't want to get flagged for paying too much in cash because the FBI is already on her. So she calls her friend Steve Chambers. Steve Chambers comes, uses an assumed name, and gives her a few $1,000s to pay for the van in cash. A couple of nights later, the Baltimore Orioles and the Boston Red Sox are playing a baseball game. It goes into extra innings. And the game ends late. Meanwhile, in Charlotte, North Carolina, the FBI is waiting with bated breath for this week's episode of America's Most Wanted. And in this week's episode of America's Most Wanted, in 1997, is not a dramatized footage of a man stealing things from a bank, but rather the video from the Loomis Fargo vault that shows David Ghant's face taking money and putting it in the back of a Loomis Fargo truck.
That's anxiety central right there.
So they are waiting for the picture to show, for the tips to come in, but the baseball game has gone into extra innings. And when the baseball game ends, you hear that iconic voice of America's Most Wanted come on and say, "If you have any information about David Ghant, please call this number." And yet no footage of David Ghant was shown and no picture. Nobody on the East Coast ever saw the story that night. So no tips come in and nobody's any the wiser. Meanwhile, Steve is continuing to spend and move money, buying safe deposit boxes all over the city. He's also bought a couple of storage sheds, and one of those storage sheds, he has his cousin go check on the money. Now, she goes to look at it, and she tells her husband where it is, and they go, and they're making periodic stops to the storage shed, but they don't have keys. Now, her husband has been involved in some nefarious dealings in the past, and when he gets wind of what's being stored in that storage shed, he borrows a plasma cutter from a friend of his, goes to the storage shed, cuts the lock off, replaces it with one that's identical to it, though it would be keyed differently, and steals $1.3 million out of the storage shed. Now, this is now the hottest money in the United States of America because it has been stolen twice. And as Steve is laying the groundwork for all of these other things to make sure that all the money is stashed away, they never stop spending. Meanwhile, Mike McKinney has used the portion of his money that was given to him to commit the murder against David Ghant. And Mike McKinney, who's working an $8 an hour job, all of a sudden shows up with the GMC Tahoe. But not just the regular one. The most expensive, most decked out version of it. Nearly a $70,000, remember this is 1997, nearly a $70,000 four-wheel drive SUV. And as all of his friends are oohing and aahing over the vehicle, he can't really tell him. He says it was like an inheritance that he kind of got, and his story on it's really vague. The FBI gets a call from America's Most Wanted to say, "Hey, listen, we're going to do a Make Good episode." So the next week, after he's bought this Tahoe, the America's Most Wanted episode airs. In the America's Most Wanted episode, you see David Ghant's face. And then there's the call to action. The phone lines light up. Tips from all over the country are coming in, but the Eastern Seaboard in particular, where everything happened, people are saying that they saw David Ghant in the airport, that they saw him at dinner, that they know somebody that knows him. And then in the midst of all of these are these buried things about a couple of families. There's this guy that somebody knows that all of a sudden he showed up to work with a Tahoe he shouldn't be able to afford. And there's this new family that just moved in at the golf course that we're not really sure about. And they don't really belong here. And they've got a giant velvet Elvis in a $600,000 house. And they're throwing all of these extravagant parties with people that really don't seem like they belong at a golf course. Well, as the FBI starts to look at some of these tertiary things, they come across the name Steve Chambers, which to them means very little. But as they begin to question Steve, Steve's attorney lets them know he doesn't want to answer any more questions. Interestingly enough, his attorney's name has popped up one more time in the Hillybilly heist, and that is to say that Miss Kelly Campbell was not going to be answering any questions on the polygraph. So they look at purchases that Kelly Campbell has made, wondering if there's a connection between the two, since so many people had called in wondering if Steve had a part of this. They come to find the Toyota Sienna. When they find the van, they go and trace it back, and doing a little bit of legwork, what the FBI discovers is the assumed name that Steve Chambers used to buy the Toyota and Chambers Industries were also names that were part of a hot check writing scheme that was recently being prosecuted by some of the local banks. Steve Chambers used Chambers Incorporated and this same name to open up accounts in which he was writing these hot checks, which we talked about in the beginning, that were being investigated at the very time that the robbery took place. So now the FBI has the lawyer Steve Chambers, and Kelly Campbell all on their radar. They've got enough stuff in order to get a warrant, and so they begin to tap the phone lines, and they hear all of these discussions between Steve and Kelly that have to do with things about the money. Now, the way that the Penn record works is that if something were to be discussed that didn't sound like it was part of the funds or the bank robbery, they would have to immediately hang up the phone. But every time that Steve and Kelly talked, it seemed like there was something there, as well as Steve's having all of these really interesting conversations with his relatives about safe deposit boxes. So the FBI puts tabs on Steve. And one night they hear Steve talking to Mike McKinney, a.k.a. Bruno. Bruno's making another trip down to Mexico in order to make another drop for Dave. And when they hear the name Dave, they feel like they've got him. Bruno goes down, talks to Dave, they meet. Dave has a conversation with Kelly, and in his conversation with Kelly after the drop, Kelly lets something slip about the way that they're spending money. Dave's furious because they only gave him a few $1,000s this time, and by this time he's in Playa del Carmen. He's trying to make a way for himself, living in an actual, now he's moved away from tourist cities and is living in like a little Mexican village that is occupied by the weekends on the weekends by people visiting via cruise ships. Kelly lets slip that Steve is spending the money like crazy. When Dave presses her, she says, well, I mean, I got a van, but Steve bought like a $600,000 house and they're throwing these wild parties all the time. Bruno's set up for Dave to meet a guy that's going to take him to Brazil. The next time they meet, Dave lets Bruno know, hey, you know all this spending is happening. You know why this is. And Bruno's like, listen, here's the new plan. You're going to go to Brazil. You're going to get way out of Dodge. You're going to meet with this contact that I've got. He's part of the Mexican mafia. He's going to take you. He's going to give you your plane ticket. He's going to give you your new identity. You're going to get out of there. Dave happens to pick up a Super Bowl jersey of Jerome Bettis. He's not a huge Steelers fan, but he likes sports and he's got money to play with, so why not? It's an authentic Jerome Bettis jersey from the 1996 Super Bowl. It's got the Super Bowl logo on it. It's cool. Even though they lost to the Cowboys, it doesn't matter. It's a great piece of memorabilia and paraphernalia. And so Dave's wearing it to go meet this guy in Mexico, this Mexican mafia guy who, for a couple of $100, gives him his ticket to Brazil. And then as they start talking about the jersey, because this is a large guy, he wants to figure out where Dave got the jersey. Dave starts talking to him about football. They get on pretty good. Dave gives him the jersey, and the guy says, hey, you know what? Why don't you come to dinner with me and my family on Friday night? Dave says, sure, why not? I'm not going to leave by then, so certainly. Dave goes to dinner. They start talking. He's hanging out with this guy's family. The guy takes him outside of the balcony. Starts talking to him a little bit about the family business and what they do. That they've got mafia ties, and Dave was like, yeah, I figured you were into that. He goes, your buddy Bruno. We don't like him. He's rubbing us the wrong way. He's asking the wrong kinds of questions. He says, okay, what's that got to do with me? It's like, look, man, he hired us to kill you. Dave's stunned. I never liked Bruno. Things there were never going really great. But it's at this point that he realizes it's more at stake than just not getting his share. So this Mexican gangster tells me, he's like, hey, don't go to Brazil. You need to go somewhere else. Change your address, change your location, go somewhere. Because it's possible that they're going to be waiting for you in Brazil because they know all the details about this ticket. He and Dave shake hands, gives him a hug. Dave indulges to him everything about the heist. And this guy goes, go be safe. Sends him in a cab with some friends of his. They take him on his way, relocate him into a place right outside of Cancun where he's able to lay low. Bruno gets back, calls Steve Chambers. During the conversation with Steve Chambers, Bruno lets Steve know the hit wasn't able to take place. It's going to be a lot harder to kill Dave than what he thought. Maybe they can get Kelly to go down. If they can get Kelly to go down there, Kelly can take a syringe full of bleach and inject it into Dave because Dave is still in love with Kelly. The FBI hears this. Then the FBI listens in on a conversation between Steve and Kelly where Steve tells Kelly his new plan to kill Dave is going to involve her going down and injecting Dave with a syringe full of bleach. Now, Kelly doesn't love Dave, but she's also not a murderer. She's getting cold feet. She's worried about the whole thing. And after hearing this, the FBI determines it's time to move. Now, they've already been on to Dave a little bit because they've been tracing some of the phone calls that were made on the payphone. They make it down there and they've changed their operation. It's no longer going to be whether or not David Ghant is apprehended for a bank robbery. Now they're shifting gears and they are trying to save David Ghant's life. Dave comes downstairs from his apartment, tries to do some laundry, and realizes pretty quickly during the week in Playa del Carmen that he's typically the only white guy. This is a Mexican village that turns into a tourist town on weekends, but other than that, he sticks out like a sore thumb. But there's one person who sticks out like an even more sore thumb. And that's the late 20s FBI agent in his black suit with his military Ivy League haircut and shaved face. On his way back to an apartment, Dave is stopped by the FBI agents and let him know that there is a price for his head. At this point, Dave lets himself go. He's arrested. He's flown back to the United States. The FBI moves in on Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell as well because now they've got Steve on not just the robbery, but also on a murder-for-hire plot. When they get to Steve's place, one of the things they find is that people who have been taking care of Steve's estate for him and other things have been hiding barrels of dog food. But under a couple of inches of dog food are barrels full of stolen Loomis Fargo money. When Steve Chambers is arrested, the mastermind, quote-unquote, behind the entire thing starts to sing, realizing that if he turns other people in, that it's going to lessen his sentence, and so he does. He rolls over on Kelly, rolls over on Dave, and then his parents, and then Michelle's parents, and then his cousins, and his friends, and everybody who ever opened an account or a safe deposit box or a storage facility for him. And every one of them now becomes an accomplice to a federal money laundering and bank scheme. And that includes his attorney, Mr. Jeff Guller. Now, the trial's pretty short. And during the trial, one thing comes to light pretty quick. Dave might have been the guy with all the guts, but he was also the guy in this heist that was the most expendable. At this point, Dave's been on the lam for 6 months and has not seen his parents nor communicated at all with his wife, Tammy. They don't see him until almost the day of the trial, when both his mom and his wife have to take the stand as character witnesses to tell the judge and the jury that this is not the kind of guy that David Ghant is. As his wife and his mother are sitting there hearing the plot that David had in order to rob this money and also to leave his wife and run away with Kelly Campbell, waiting for her to come to Mexico. Both of them stood there in the face of that and attested to what a good heart he has, what a good boy he's always been, what an upstanding member of society has been, and that there's a reason that he was trusted with that Loomis Fargo key in the first place, and that's because under there, he's really a good and trustworthy guy. Steve Chambers admits to the murder-for-hire plot, though he says that it was Kelly's idea. So he takes full responsibility for the heist. And in the trial for Dave, the prosecution loses continuity in their story. Because Kelly says, it was my idea. Now, who knows what motivated Kelly to say this, whether it was her trying to take credit, what was her trying to discredit Steve, because Steve had testified against her in such a way that it made her have an incredibly bad light and prevented her from being able to see her kids. And all this crazy back and forth that goes on during these trials, it's hard to say, but David Ghant ultimately is sentenced to 8 years in prison with the caveat that he pay back several $1 million, which will never happen. Kelly Campbell gets a similar sentence, but Steve Chambers. Danley, what was the sentence for Steve Chambers?
I believe it was 11 years and 3 months.
Steve was also fined nearly $3.5 million. But in the process, in order to get his sentence reduced to 11 years and 3 months, Steve Chambers indicted 24 other people. His parents and his wife's parents among those that were indicted. And one of the things that makes this particularly bad is that Steve's parents had no idea about his nefarious dealings. And Michelle Chambers, his wife's parents, had watched Michelle leave her husband for Steve. Her husband who fought in Desert Storm, who was friends with Steve, and said, "Steve, will you watch my wife and kids while I'm gone?" Steve, who was dating their other daughter, goes and marries Michelle. They've watched Michelle throw everything away for this guy, and now they are on the hook for his dealings. The Hillbilly Heist.
Hence the Hillbilly Heist. All of the jokes that were made during the trial.
The Hillbilly Heist comes to an end, and among the items auctioned off are a Harley Davidson, a boat, the $600,000 house, the BMW Z3, and the item that made the most headlines, the Velvet Elvis. The Velvet Elvis was really only worth about $30, and the auctioneer expected that it might bring maybe $1,000. Well, among those items, the Elvis was the one that was the most sought after. And up it goes, as the very first bid is $1,200. Then $1,300, and finally it's sold to a man named Tom Shaw for $1,600, who is the owner of the American Gun and Pawn Shop, where it hangs to this day.
He actually said there's a quote that he says, "I was prepared to pay whatever it cost," said pawnbroker Tom Shaw.
The Harley Davidson that was taken sold for $16,000. In total, the auction of all the possessions, minus the house, now the house goes in a different type of auction, but these are all the possessions, went for $360,000.
They actually made some money off the deal.
They did make some money off the deal.
Of course, that's not true, because they ended up recovering 88%.
Only 88%. So there's still money that's out there. Now, all of our major players are out of prison now. We know Dave is driving heavy machinery, but Kelly and Steve have wandered off into obscurity. Which begs the question, at the end of the movie Masterminds, there's a barrel that falls into a pond right beside a golf course. With all the money that Steve took and hid and all the aliases that he used, is that $2 million at the bottom of a golf course pond?
Or in the backwoods somewhere in a...
Is it under a trailer park? Or maybe this. Maybe that cousin that took $1.5 million, ran to Colorado, started a business, and came back, only to be convicted of money laundering. That particular cousin was known for being pretty tight-lipped, pretty aggressive. He'd had nefarious dealings in the past. If you're really going to be a guy that messes with a heavy, have a real gangster on your side. Somebody that you know would go and not say a word. You're not going to give it to the lovable, affable anti-hero down in Cancun. You're definitely not going to give the extra money to Kelly.
To the plump Kelly, who rarely smiles. When she does, it stops traffic.
But might you have given it to the man who stole from you, set up perfectly to hide all the way across the country in a state that Steve Chambers was never known to have visited?
I guess we will never know.
Seems plausible.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it, Danley. That's the story of the Hillybilly Heist. Now, there's so many more details and odds and ends and weird turns, but the main thing that you should take away from this is that David Ghant, while in Mexico, lived it up for 6 months on the lam. And to this day, not only is he known for the Hillybilly Heist, but on his way to work, every day he used to listen to the John Boy and Billy Big Show. From what we heard, one of the highlights for David Ghant after he was incarcerated was listening to the John Boy and Billy Big Show talk about the hillbilly bank robber who sat in his apartment in Cozumel, Mexico, eating lobster and M&Ms day after day. Fame comes to us in mysterious ways. And for David Ghant, it was Zach Galifianakis and $17 million. So who knows what happened to that money?
Yeah.
But if you want to know the real story in the words of the man himself, David Ghant will be on the Rev and Rep podcast, on the main podcast, in just a couple of weeks. Dave talks to us specifically about the heist, about his new book, The Book of Dave, and sets us straight on some of the details in this episode that maybe all the people in the media and the reporters didn't quite get right. Listen to the man himself to hear what the heist was and the words of the one guy who was committed enough and fed up enough with life to drive out of the vault with $17 million.
And go down as a legend.
When David Ghant did arrive in prison, unlike Steve Chambers and Kelly Campbell, he was met with a hero's welcome. Because it's a very rare person, even behind the slammer, that has that much angst to stick it to the man. He became a prison celebrity, and in the years we've talked about, was on many talk shows, but also had a movie made about the heist in which he was a consultant. David Ghant, the legend and the true mastermind behind the Hillybilly Heist. If you guys like this kind of content and the things that we're putting out with the Rev and Rep Investigates, make sure to leave us a comment or a review. Those 5-star reviews really help us out a lot, not just with the main podcast, but also here with these. Also, make sure you check out the interview with David Ghant, which is upcoming. You can hear more from the Rev and Rep at RevandRep.com. Whether you're listening on Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, a good review helps us out a ton. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll be back.